Ben, what is happening to prominent socialists?
Well, I was doing an article about Benn's death, and it certainly is true that this was the most prominent socialist in British history. The most prominent socialist, the most influential and prominent socialist. And he was this because he had an insider knowledge of the system of power in Britain. And that was unique. And that stemmed from him coming from the sort of semi-aristocrats of politics, if you like. His family were politicians. His father was a Liberal MP. His father then became a Labour MP, then a Labour Lord. And he began his political career as a right-winger in the Labour Party. That's Tony Benn. But over the period of working to try to improve the living standards and conditions of the mass of people and trying to make the system within capitalism, within democracy, work, he discovered that all around, in spite of knowing, I mean, I remember meeting him in the House of Parliament, and he would like nip out and chat to a Tory MP, nip out and chat to a Tory Lord, nip out and talk to someone else. He was a player inside the House of Commons and the House of Lords. You know, he danced with the Queen when he was 16 years of age. So he came from that entire establishment circle. But, and it's a big but, he stood on certain ideological principles. He believed in democracy, and he believed that democracy would result, by definition, in the will of the people coming to reality. So he tried to make that work. But as he tried to make that work over the decades, when he was elected first as a Member of Parliament in 1950, up until about 1967-68, when he was Minister of Technology, he discovered that actually the entire structure of power is organised against radical change in the interest of the majority. It's organised to maintain the wealth and power of the elite who rule over British society. For example, there are 6,000 families in Britain who own 47% of the land in this country. In the world, there are 82 people who own more wealth than half of the world's population. In Britain as a whole, there are 5 million companies, but of those 5 million companies, 200 companies own more than 80% of the stock market shares, in other words, of the entire stock of the country. And therefore, in terms of corporate production, and therefore, these tiny elite are able to exercise massively disproportionate power, external to parliamentary and democratic procedure. And this allows them to control the dynamics of politics, regardless of what the popular will is, or even what a minister of the government might want to be done in a specific sphere. And that's the reason why Benn suddenly discovered during the 1960s that actually the system of capitalism, when it reached the end of the boom period, the long boom from 1947 until the late 1960s, when this came to an end, the question was, who would suffer when the economy contracts? And then what they did was, instead of having these, what they used to call tea and sandwiches at number 10, or tea and sandwiches in the workplaces, where the trade union office used to be here, and the boss's office was here, and they would get together when there was a dispute. After that, they decided they would drive down the living standards of the workers, and do that on a national scale. It began with Ted Heath, when he attacked the miners' union and the dockers' union and introduced industrial relations laws, to which the workers responded almost with a general strike in the docks in East London. Then the miners came on strike, and there was a 3-day working week that brought down Ted Heath's government. At that time, the Conservative Party tried to figure out how they could break these unions and drive down living standards. And the way they did it was, they made a plan from 1974 onwards to smash the miners' union and to break the power of the organised labour movement. And that was what Margaret Thatcher was elected to do. And it was because of experiencing this process that Tony Benn shifted to the left and adopted the ideas of a much more radical policy, which came to be called the alternative economic strategy, which meant pretty much some of the things that I argue for, public ownership of major banks, public ownership of major industries, democratic control thereof. He argued for a plan for jobs. 1 million jobs a year, 1 million homes a year. Well, that's a contemporary plan. So all these idiots like David Cameron and Boris Johnson and Ed Miliband, who all turn around and say, Tony Benn was a marvellous man, but I didn't agree with his ideas. But his ideas were a bit eccentric. Or but he was a maverick whose ideas lost the Labour Party the election. In actual fact, had Tony Benn won the election in 1981 for deputy leader of the Labour Party, and had the Labour Party adopted policies to the left, the entire balance of power in Britain and Europe could have been organised in a different direction. In other words, public ownership would have become a dominant question, and Thatcherism may never have happened. But it was about this question of power. Who controls, who wields power in society? And now, of course, the truth, I watched a video I made of Tony Benn speaking in 2003. I watched that this morning. I was trying to make a radio show about it. And in there he said, once the war breaks out, and this was before the war started, it was just after he'd gone to Iraq to talk with Saddam Hussein. You may remember that, some of you. He went to Iraq, he discussed with Saddam Hussein, he broadcast it on television. So everyone knew that Saddam Hussein had point-blank denied that he had any chemical weapons. As it turned out, he was completely honest. It was completely true. He had no chemical weapons. And that point, of course, was, and along with the other lies that Tony Blair told and the Western leaders told in order to invade Iraq, at that time, Tony Benn said there was expected to be 500,000 deaths. In fact, there were 2 million people died in Iraq as a consequence of the war. Many of them directly through bombing, many of them through conflict-related deaths after the war. And this idea, and what he said was that people will discuss, and it's true, will discuss what the alternative is to constantly going to war against weaker countries to maintain global dominance of the largest imperial powers, Britain, America, and their allies. And the conclusion he drew was that when an economic crisis comes, then the entire balance of ideological thinking, Thatcherism, neoliberalism, would begin to disintegrate. We are witnessing that. We're witnessing it ideologically. I notice it when I speak at Speaker's Corner. You can notice it when politicians come on television and answer people's questions. People generally don't have a coherent ideological response to these questions, because most people don't study political economy. They don't study 200 years of imperial history. And if they do, they get the school of teaching of history and economics, which is the mainstream school. In other words, Paul Samuelson in economics, or Krugman in economics, or Martin Wolf from the Financial Times in economics, or the official representatives of politics, who all argue that the system of capitalism is an immovable barrier that you can never change. It's the best system ever, and it's the best system there can be or ever will be. Therefore, the entire discussion fails to delve into the real nature of what the structure of society means for our lives. It is the structure of capitalist ownership of the commanding heights of the economy, the largest companies, that determines the fate of the world. That's what shapes our world. That's what determines how we live. It also, even to the extent it determines why people in Hyde Park today. Because the monetary structure of capitalism organises all human activity. So people wake at a certain time, go to work at a certain time, transport's organised around it at a certain time, they go on holiday on a certain time, the aeroplanes fly or disappear at a certain time, the governments go to war at certain times. All these things are organised around a financial structure of operation geared towards money, commodity, money plus. Money, commodity, money plus. In other words, if someone invests, they invest to make a profit, right? There's no purpose, we are told, in investing in anything unless it makes a profit. What for? What purpose? What reason can there be? Nothing works unless you make a profit. That's what they say. That's the ideological structure that dominates the entire planet today, or nearly the entire planet. No, of course it's not true. that it has to dominate the entire planet. In fact, the rationality of the ordinary human being, I say ordinary, of the normal human being, is the opposite of that. People don't start out saying every single thing they do, how they're going to make money out of it. Right? In fact, what normal people say is they say, I wish that the things I could do, I wish the things I want to do, I wish the things my children could do, they'd be able to do without having to worry about money, without having to think about money. The consequence of that is there's a direct clash, which is reflected in the structure of order of the reproduction of the system. The reproduction of the working class takes place like this. I sell my ability to work on the marketplace for 40 hours a week. I receive a wage at the end of the week. I spend that wage on a bottle of water in Hyde Park, £1. Well, 99 pence. A travel card once a week. I don't know how much that is. I get an Oyster card, a Boris bike, and I drive my car sometimes. So those are my travel expenses. Some food from the shops, pay Sainsbury's some money, pay the landlord some money, pay for lots of beer on a Friday and Saturday night, and then return to work on Monday. Now, that structure of reproduction means that the majority of working people do not have any money at the end of the month. They start money, sell their commodity, labour power, come back to money, back to commodity. So the worker sells their commodity to get money and has nothing but their commodity to sell again. After all, if it was any different, if, for example, I worked 1 week and was paid for 6 months, I might just go on holiday. I might not be so controllable by my employer. So the workers receive only what it takes to bring them back to work. But the capitalists, those who must invest to make money, they start out with money and they think, I've got here £20 or £20 million or £20 billion. It's only a number representing something. What it actually represents is a relationship of power. Now, that power the capital gives the capitalist, but not the worker, is the power to employ the worker. And by employing the worker, you gain their energy. And their energy is the productive energy that has created this planet as we know it. Not over one generation, but over all the generations going back to Lucy in Ethiopia 6 million or 2.2 million years ago, beg my pardon. All the energies that we have produced, all the wonders of art, science, technology, the laying down of pavement, the reorganisation of parks, the building of buildings, the creation of spaceships, all this energy that we have historically accumulated, just like the knowledge of human beings historically accumulated, firstly in libraries in Alexandria, then in the Library of Congress, the British Library, now on the internet. So it is with the human productive potential that we have produced the wealth of society to serve the needs of human beings. But instead of that being used to serve the needs of human beings, it is the private property of a handful of individuals. 82 people own more wealth than half of the world's population. 6 million die every year of diseases caused by unclean water. By unclean water. Now, that's easily resolvable. One of the 82 billionaires could resolve that. Just one of them. And you could give them, you could take their money off them and leave them £500,000. Or if you want to be generous, £10 million. Will they be short of cash? No. However, the entire structure of capitalism is designed to reproduce the psychology of their own superiority. Of course, they know they're not superior. That's why they need to continually exercise the power of money over other human beings. Because it shows them their power. It reproduces their power. If I could offer you £50 and then withdraw it just as you reach out for it, there's a not so fast, son. First you have to show me that you really deserve it, my friend. Right? So, in this way, the entire belief system in society is structured around illusionary ideas that somehow wealthy people are clever people. Wealth and cleverness is interconnected together. Business owners are smart. Why are they smart? Because they own businesses. In actual fact, the only reason you call them smart is because they own a business. It's like if I give him £5, say now you're really clever. Because he's got £5. If he had £5 million pounds,
Oh, he started again.
instead of spend it on alcohol or drugs or whatever people do something in this society.
who says he doesn't spend it on alcohol and
He
drugs?
educates himself with the fiver, and then before the fiver's turned into a tenner and 20 quid. Simple.
Right.
Simple.
Well,
Pretty simple.
you say that it's pretty simple because your attitude is simple. Your own attitude is simple because I know, personally I know you.
You're the
And
one that was self-employed once and tried to keep
I'm not saying I'm not.
It went into receipt.
You are, however, a businessman, right?
Not.
Well, you used to be a businessman, right? And as a businessman, as a self-justification for your position, you theorize it around this illusionary idea that you expressed. For example, you said, rather than spending money on beer or cigarettes,
Drugs or alcohol.
or drugs or alcohol. Now, my friend, who manufactures cigarettes? People at their home? Who manufactures cigarettes? Is it people at their home?
No, it's like organisation.
It's a big organisation. It's a profitable industry, right? So they do spend their money on cigarettes. Drugs constitute around 10% of world trade, according to The Economist magazine a few years ago. 10% of world trade. Now, who invests this money? I mean, some people grow, a bit of grass in their house, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about large-scale industries. These industries are capitalist enterprises. Or do you think they run them to make a loss? Now, alcohol. Who runs the breweries in Britain?
Yeah, you.
There are large corporations, right, which run the industry and control the supply of alcohol in society. You just told me that the people who are stupid are people who spend their money on alcohol and drugs.
You can spend your money on smokes and alcohol after you've made the money.
No, hang on a minute.
40 years of age, but not at 20, 21, 22.
No, you misunderstand. You are misunderstanding the relationship.
We're not.
I was explaining that the capitalists spend money, for example, on drugs and alcohol. Right? They have drugs and alcohol industries. They do it on an orgy of a scale, far larger than a drunken kid in Camden on a Saturday night, right? But you condemn the drunken kid in Camden on the Saturday night.
Well, I never get drunk.
Whereas that person,
Simple as that.
if you feel sorry for them, is being exploited by a large capitalist selling them drugs to get them drunk, right? So you cannot maintain your contention that they spend their money on drugs and alcohol and the clever business people don't, because it's not true. Many of the business people make their money directly from drugs and alcohol. So the contention is false. So strip that away, and what's left of your argument? Some people have the power to buy a brewery and sell alcohol. Other people can only consume the goods produced by a brewery because they don't earn enough money to buy a brewery, right? That's really what you're saying.
What I'm saying is use part of your money to improve your education and then better yourself off wherever and what way. You don't have to buy a brewery or a drug company or a smoke company. Small shop,
So
small
the argument about drugs and alcohol is an irrelevant one. That's what you're agreeing with me on now, right? So the question is, why does a capitalist make money? They make money because they employ other human beings who are paid what it takes to bring them back to work. But what they produce is over and above what it takes to bring them back to work. So their wage is less than what they produce. That surplus goes in the hands of capitalists. Rent, interest and profit. It's not so difficult to understand.
What do you believe about investment? Anyone can invest. You can buy, spend, save. If you only spend and you don't save and you don't invest, you keep yourself down.
The question about whether you have savings or not, as an individual, you can discuss the question like you're discussing. Shall I spend my £20 down the pub this evening, or shall I save it? That, of course, hang on. That, of course, is a perfectly rational discussion, but it confuses the issue, because the actual issue is, what is the quantity, the relationship with the quantity of cash that the majority of people have, and the quantity of cash that the capitalists have, that the large investors own. Because they own 200 companies, own 80% of the value of the stock market. Because of that, they control and dominate capital. Once you dominate capital, many things flow from it. If you dominate the marketplace, anybody's played Monopoly, you know. You only have to play for 3 hours, and someone owns the whole lot. Right? Once you own the whole lot, well then all you can do is wander around, going to jail or paying rent. Right? That's the only two alternatives. So that is not an illusion. It's a reality. We live in a society where capital is monopolized before we are born. Before we are born. We are born into a society with rigid hierarchical division of wealth and power, and the power derives from the wealth. That is what Tony Benn revealed. His own experience showed him that the wealth and power, even though he came from that environment, he saw that even though he spoke with one person who he might better convince, and then with another person, even a Tory or an upper middle class individual, then he speaks with another Tory or upper class individual, and they'll sit and say, yes, that's a good idea, Tony. Why don't we help the poor? Why don't we house the poor? Why don't we pass good legislation? Then what you discover is that the structure of power behind the scenes, shaping the ideology of the upper stratum of society and their politicians, is organized around the power of a tiny hierarchical elite at the top who consistently are able to manipulate and shape politics from the top in every or nearly every single country in the world.
Tony Benn selling his £15 million house in Holland Park to help the poor. He stayed in it for 50 years. It would be a protest. Good start to sell the house, wouldn't it?
Well,
I live in a council house like Globe Crow.
I don't think that would be a good start. I think that's misunderstanding the essence of the question that we're discussing. We are not discussing ownership of housing. That's a separate question at the moment. Nor are we discussing an individual who's got £15 million, so you say. The question is, what is the investment structure? That's what you ask as well. What is the investment structure? What determines investment as a whole in society?
Basically, if you're not going to get a return on your money, you're not going to invest in anything.
What's that?
If you're not going to get a return on your money, i.e. make a profit on your money, you're not going to invest in it.
And what decides?
You're not going to attract the creative brains onto the project.
The question of what decides
that's what works.
whether you can make a profit or not is a question that perplexes political economists, from Adam Smith to David Ricardo to Karl Marx. And the solution that Marx came up with, and actually Adam Smith and Ricardo, was that the essence of the wealth in society is labour. Now, all of them said that. Now, what happens, however, is that in order to understand why profits fluctuate and why cycles happen in economies, you have to look deeper underneath the surface of appearances and try to discover the dynamics of a system flowing not just in your individual business, but across the entire planet, or across the entire city, country, continent, and then planet. Once you analyse this at a macro level, on a world scale, you begin to be able to break down the dynamics of the system. That's why we have world crises, world economic crisis. And also, alongside world economic crisis, you have world political, world cultural, world social crisis. Mass unemployment on a world scale. Mass poverty on a world scale. This is because profit determines investment. You're right. When the profit is high, investment is high. When the profit is low, investment seizes up. That's what we have today. Investment has seized up in the Western world. In America,
it goes into another country.
Oh, really?
They
Where?
start investing.
Where?
Well, we've invested, a lot of money been invested in Ethiopia recently. That's come a long way in the last 20 years. We've got billions been invested in African economies.
The truth of the matter is,
okay at the moment.
Africa has received...
A 9% return on your money in
Africa is growing rapidly because of Chinese state investment. Not because...
The Europeans are investing in Africa as well.
My friend, the Europeans have invested in Africa for 150 years. Right? 150 years they've been investing in Africa. But the truth of the matter is, when the Western countries invested in Africa, Actually, what happened was the African countries invested in Europe. Or better said, the wealth of Africa was transferred to Europe.
Companies invested in Europe.
I said, yes, I didn't say African companies. What I meant was the following. If we put money into, as we did, into the Congo and financed Mobutu, Mobutu took the copper of the Congo, sold it to the Western countries, and then the money that came to pay for the copper was put in the Western banks. In other words, the Congolese, outside of Mobutu and his family, got nothing out of it. So in other words, the Congolese invested in Europe, rather than the Europeans investing in the Congo. Even though it looked like the Europeans were investing in the Congo, actually they were plundering the Congo.
Okay, the Economist magazine had an article about 6 months ago, and it looked at 10 people, and Mobutu was on the list, and he stole the minimum amount of money on the list of 10. It was the guy in Egypt, Mubarak, that stole the most, something like 20 billion
pounds. Not connected with Britain and America.
America would give him a lot of money.
Apparently he took 60,000 million pounds.
Of
Of course, what happens is, when we, in inverted commas, turn around and oppose Mobutu, in other words, after he was about to be overthrown, or when he was about to be overthrown, we changed sides and opposed him, then all of a sudden, we said, let's freeze his assets. When they say freeze his assets, what they mean is, let's keep his assets.
Well, I don't think we froze Mobutu's assets because we didn't know where they were for a kick-off. Right. I don't think we'll be too successful.
The latest one is to say, we're going to freeze the assets of the wealthy Russians. Freeze the assets of the wealthy Russians. In other words, the money that the thieves have stolen from Russia and put into London, that money we're going to keep hold of. And of course, the Russians want to keep it here anyway. Although they might move it to some other offshore island, perhaps one connected with.
Russians have been taking a lot of money out of London in the last couple of days. There's evidence to say that a lot of Russians and Gazprom employees have been taking a lot of their money out of London last year. So they're not keeping it here, they're taking it out. We know that for a fact in the last year or so.
It would be quite rational to do so.
Well, okay,
however,
so
the essence of what the British like to do, and have done historically, that's why Britain isn't utterly and completely bankrupt yet, is because the City of London is an instrument for global theft. And because it's an instrument for global theft and the plunder of the peoples of the entire planet, backed by military action around the world to secure and maintain that theft and system of theft, then of course we are told that when we go to war, or when we impose sanctions, when we tell the Russians what they can and cannot do, or when we tell the Iraqis or Iranians or Afghanistanis, or when we tell one of the other stans, when we go and bomb Afghanistan or Pakistan or Brixton, we always send someone in on an aeroplane who speaks perfect English, lands there and appears, he's been studying in Sandhurst, or he's been like the Republican Guard in Iraq, or he's been studying in Oxford, like David Cameron and his friends, or he's been studying in Cambridge, and now all of a sudden he arrives back as the saviour of the nation, after we bombed the nation. So he is there to facilitate continued robbery of the people of those countries. But of course, the robbery is not only external robbery, it is also internal robbery. The people of Britain are also robbed. And one of the ways they rob them is to tell them, buy a house. It's not a house, it's a dream. You buy a house, you get a wife. You buy a house, you get a husband. You get a husband, you got children. Then you can buy some carpets and a big television. And then you can sit back on television and watch buying a house on television. Or doing up a house, or how to buy a house in France. And then once you've done that, you can only sit at home, because after all, you don't have enough money to pay a mortgage on a £350,000 house. But the biggest worry in Britain, of course, is will property prices collapse? Now, if property prices collapse, that would be the worst thing in the world, because then the illusion also collapses. So what do they do?
Have already collapsed in Britain in the last 20 years.
The government says.
It had two flips in the market.
The government says, first, in order to prevent an economic crash, we need rising property prices. So, in order to maintain rising property prices, we want to make sure that, for example, no more housing benefit recipients, no more scavenging unemployed, no more scavenging refugees, or Bulgarians, or Romanians, or Europeans, no more parasites from the poorest classes begging in Hyde Park. Instead of this, we will help. We will give help to those who really need it. The middle classes who want to buy a house for £600,000. We'll give them a guarantee of 15% of their mortgage in order to ensure that the banks, which we salvaged with government money, whether it's your money, will be solvent by backing up with false expectations of the value of property. In order to maintain this illusion and maintain the votes of the Tories in their favour, they promote an entire campaign of robbing the mass of people of their own wealth by getting them to buy property that is not worth more than 25% of the price that they pay for it. Not worth more than 25%. You're a building worker, you know that very well, right? You know very well the cost of building a 3-bedroom house, except for the land, the cost of building a 3-bedroom house is no more than £50,000 or £60,000. A brand new 3-bedroom house, not a Victorian crap hole falling down with bay windows which let the wind through, right? But a brand new building made by the Germans, right? They'll build it for £60,000 3-bedroom house with everything in it, right? Now, in Britain, you turn around and say £60,000, they think you're an idiot. Where are you living? Liverpool? No. Now, I say Britain. If you're in London, that is. Where are you living in Liverpool 7 or Liverpool 8? You know, the riot zones. So the consequence of that is that the difference between the actual value of the property, in other words, the cost of production of the property, of a new property that is not a rotten old flea bag, a new property, £50,000, £60,000. So all the difference between that and the 300,000 and 500,000 and 1 million people are paying in London for the same 3-bedroom property, but a Victorian property, is fictitious capital. It's entirely fictitious. It has no value unless you sell it now and bugger off out the country. So, but what it does do, by getting you to mortgage, pay a mortgage of £350,000 for a 1-bedroom flat in Putney, what it does is, it compels you to work for them, for the banks, for the profits of the private companies. It compels you to work for them, paying taxes to the government who is subsidising these banks and private corporations.
There's nothing wrong with paying a mortgage for 25 years instead of paying rent for 25 years. There's no rocket science in you get something after 25 years to fall back on.
Yes,
As a pension.
Thus speaks the multi-headed Hydra. Because, like Medusa, with many snakes coming out of its head. One comes at you on the mortgage side. Then the other comes at you, oh, you don't want a mortgage? Right, I'll bite your ass off then. So one comes at you from behind and grabs you and says, I will charge you £1,200 in rent to live in a flea pit in Putney. And that's how it works. Because in conjunction, and of course you can tell that's the truth. You go across the road here, look at that shop there. That one there. Right? What do they do?
You've got to be pretty stupid if
Next door to that shop.
You've got to be pretty stupid if you move into a flea pit for £1,200 in Putney.
Next door to that shop. Next door to that shop over there is a shop that sells water, sweets, and ice cream. But the shop over there makes more money. It's a more plush shop. And there's only 2 people sitting in the shop. And those people don't have any goods they're selling. On the contrary, they're only selling other people's goods. And what they're selling is an image of a house. I saw people looking in the window. £3.5 million. How many rooms? It was quite a large house actually. It was in the countryside. £3.5 million. And then next to that they have rent as well. So they do a double game. The estate agent who produced nothing, it's like Hegel used to say, from nothing, with nothing, to nothing. Estate agents, the most useless human beings in Britain, apart from Conservative MPs, the estate agents sell nothing. And then if they can't sell nothing called houses, mortgages in other words, what they sell is rent. They stand between you and a key and say, pay me a 1 month of an annual rent for me to open a door to you and say, oh, it's a very nice place. People like to live in this area. There's a good school nearby, and there's Sainsbury's just down the road. It's really convenient. And that they get £1,000 for. 1,000 for good money if you can get it. £1,000 for saying that to somebody. Then they drive around in that shop there. They've got nothing but that, just some little pictures of houses. That's all they got, right? So they have nothing, from nothing, with nothing, to nothing. However, the entire country has been so indoctrinated by this shit, and it's understandable why. Because it's difficult to earn money. It's difficult to earn money. So people don't like the guy there, Gordon, he said a couple of minutes ago. He goes, yeah, but you've got to pay rent if you don't pay mortgage. No. We should have public housing for the people. Massive program of public housing. Second, how are you going to house people now? Look around town at all the empty buildings. Everywhere you go, there are empty buildings. On Park Lane, dozens of empty buildings. In the wealthiest street in the country, I think it's 15 empty buildings, right? All around town, empty. This building here, most of it's been empty 25 years. That building on the corner, it's been empty 30 years. 30 years, that building. Enough housing for about 50 people. 30 years empty. Now, if you take these properties into ownership, local council ownership, and provide them as housing for the people, then we wouldn't have to spend so much money on housing benefit for the poorer people who are transferring money to the wealthy people. Housing benefit, which they go on about all the time, is a subsidy to the wealthy, going through the poor. That's all it is. It's not a payment to the poor. And then they go, well, how can someone live in a house that costs £200 a week when they're not working? What about the guy who owns the house and isn't working, is getting £200 for doing F all, right? What about him? If the rent instead was £60 or £50, like it should be, according to the rationale of the reproduction of housing, the cost of reproduction of housing is not 60, is it £50 a week, max. With that, we could build new houses in Britain, all over the country, £1 million a year, no problem, £1 million a year. Within 4 or 5 years, we could house the entire country without any problem. And allow 500,000 or 1 million foreigners to arrive here as well, without any problem. That would create a dynamism in the economy. But instead of this, they turn around and say, no, we can't invest in housing because only the private sector must invest. But when the private sector invests, it invests in a mealy-mouthed way. Why? Because the private sector knows they can squeeze more out of what they got. Why should I invest in new when I can make money out of the old? Keep reselling second-hand houses. Why should I bother? And then speculate the money on a global scale through the stock markets, money markets, financial markets, derivatives markets, and all the cocaine-snorting idiots in the city of London who gamble every day with the people's money. And it's the people's money. We own the banks. It's the people's money they got. So, coming back to the point. Fundamentally, there were small areas of disagreement between what I say and what Tony Benn used to say. And I think that actually Tony Benn was probably the most popular politician in Britain. Maybe some of the young generation don't know him, but he was the most popular politician because he was a person who stood by principles and learnt as he grew older. He shifted to the left as he grew older. He understood more as he grew older, which is what you should do. You're not supposed to become more ignorant and pig-headed as you grow older. You're supposed to be learning, studying, understanding, grasping, and passing on your wisdom. Wouldn't you say, madam?
Yes.
I've noticed you're doing the same type of thing. On that note, you can hear my voice a little bit dry. I used to live in East Germany, and then I lived in China. And I've always been a big follower of Marxism. But more recently I became a supporter of the two-party system. One on a Friday night, one on a Saturday night, so my throat gets worn out a little bit from the alcohol. Anyway, thanks very much for listening. See you again later on.